Hey guys, it's Simon and welcome back to another part of the LibGDX RPG tutorial series with Kotlin. So I asked in the last part if we should do something in addition so that the tutorial series is not over, and most of you mentioned that you would like to have some sort of user interface, some more stuff about scene2D, and we will actually do that, but not in this part. We will do that in the next part. So there we are going to develop a user interface. It's already available on the GitHub repository of this project, but we will cover that in the next part. What I want to do in this part is a little bit of preparation work for the next part, also some bug fixes and some improvements, because there were some comments throughout the series that people had some problems with certain parts of our game so far, and that one we are going to fix, and also we are going to upgrade certain things and improve on a couple of things. So this is like more of a part in between. If you're not interested into those improvements and those fixes, and I also will have a challenge in the video for you. So if you don't want to do that and just want to jump directly to the user interface part, then just skip this video, then enjoy the next one. But if you're interested, then stay tuned. So what we are going to do in this part is, first of all, we are going to upgrade the entity component system version. So from Fleks, currently we are using, I think, version 1.3. Exactly, yeah, so 1.3, and we are improving that to version 1.6 because there were actually some bug fixes in it, and I show you them, what I mean with them. We did, the bugs that were there did not influence our game, so we did not have a problem with that. But anyway, I think this is just a little bit of a practice that you see how you can update certain versions and how to update then your code. Also, for example, for the Kotlin language, nowadays there is 1.7.10. We could also improve that, so we can also change that. I think IntelliJ is asking us then if it should update some code stuff for us with the, I don't know, the latest things that they have in their language, but I think there is nothing to upgrade, but we could still run that. So this is how you upgrade versions, just that you have seen that. So there's this Kotlin migration stuff, then just ask and scan for deprecations, the entire project, and from what I know, there is nothing that needs to be changed. I think we used most of the up-to-date stuff. Yeah, did not find anything, so we are safe. So this is how to upgrade. Also, we don't only upgrade Fleks, we also add the support for the new tiles map editor version, because I wasn't aware of that, but I think I don't know which part it was, but the part where we introduced tiles, some people had their specific problem, and we're going to fix that. So cover that then also in this part, just that you are aware of that. And also we are going to improve the collision handling, because I mentioned once that it does not really make sense after I looked at the videos and the recordings that we use a circle shape for the despawning of the collision objects, but we actually spawn them with a rectangular shape scan. So that one we are also going to improve. So those are the things that we cover in this part. But first of all, let's go to the Fleks version upgrade. So what has changed? So we used version 1.3. After that, there was version 1.4, which simply aligned then the JVM and the Kotlin multi-platform version. And there was a breaking change in that, this DSL, that we are going to cover in this part. It's just a minor change, nothing big, but just that you see that. I can also tell you what was my thought process behind that and why we did that. Then version 1.5, that already contained the bug fix, because the number of entities property, which was part of a family where you could check. For example, I had it in one of my games. I had a family for the player entities, and I wanted to do something when the number of entities was exactly 1, and that number was returned. The number that was returned was not correct, so that was a bug which got fixed. There are also some new functions available, so is empty, is not empty, and so on for family. We don't need that in our game here, but just that you heard of this. So there's something new available, Kotlin was upgraded and so on. Then we had version 1.6, so there's also a bug fix in it, which was actually quite interesting. So if we would define a family which only contains a none of configuration, so for example, just to have a random example, let's go to our render system, and instead of that we would have, I don't know, a system which is, we don't want any entities which have that component, for example, and just that. And there had a bug in Fleks actually. So when an entity was removed, so completely removed from the world, then it was still part of that family, because of course an entity that gets removed has no component at all, which means it also does not have a dead component, but of course it should not be part of a system if that entity was removed. So that is quite could be an annoying bug fix. I also had that in one of my games where that was a problem, so that's how I found it, and that one got then fixed as well. So I would say that is quite an an important bug fix, so that's why we actually go to that version to have that available. And there's also some utility functionality. We don't need that, but just that you heard of it, to easier debug the entities, because maybe you already come to that moment where you wanted to check, so what is the status of my entity, what kind of components does it have, what kind of entities do I even have, which was maybe not that straightforward because of how the way things are stored internally in Fleks to be very efficient. And now you can very easily debug your world with this new snapshot functionality of the world. There's also a description in the Wikipedia page if you're interested into that. And it's also easily possible to load then such a snapshot. So the snapshot is really, as the name mentions, it's just a snapshot of your current world. So all the entities and all the components. It returns a map with the entities and the components. And then you could simply load a snapshot. So you pass in that map that you got before. So you pass in the entities and the components. And Fleks will then simply restore that specific states in your world, so that you can introduce, for example, a save and load system that could be then achieved with such a functionality. But yeah, that's about it. So now if we would run our game, we will hopefully see that we get an error because something should now break. So as mentioned in one of the Fleks versions, I think it was 1.4 if I remember from before, there was a DSL introduced. What does DSL stand for? I think domain something language. Don't remember what the S stands for. What it simply is, it's like that you can write in your code an readable and easy way, and also I would call it an intuitive way to set up certain things. And here, where we have now this world, there you can see something is now breaking or not compiling anymore, because that part here, that got changed to a new DSL. And first of all, what I did, so instead of creating a world with the capital W, you now need to write a small w, because I saw that most of the Kotlin libraries which have a DSL, there most of the time everything is written in lowercase. Also in LibKTX I saw that, and this also has the benefit that if you use, for example, the box2d world and the Fleks world in the same file, then you don't have a name clash anymore with the wording. So here I think we could also remove that one. So that was the reason for taking here the lowercase. Then there are now 3 blocks available within this world block. We first of all have injectables, where we define all the injectables of our world. Then we have a components block, where we define the components and component listener. In the JVM version, it's only the component listeners, but in the multi-platform version, which has the same DSL, so that one got combined, there you also need to register the components at the moment. And the last block is the systems block. So this is the 3 areas that you have when you set up a world. And yeah, I think this is also a little bit more readable, and also it's structured a little bit in a better way. And now the only thing that we need to do, so instead of writing here inject, component, listener, and system, we simply need to write add in a specific block. So for example, let's move the inject part in the injectables area, and there we simply rename now the inject stuff to add, because that is what we need to change there to support now the new DSL. So the same for the component listener. We move it in here. We select all the different component listener, replace it with add. And the last thing is with the system. So let's also move that in the systems block and replace all system calls here with add. And that should be it. So now we should be able to run our game again. And here we have it. So everything's still working perfectly. And that was the migration for Fleks. So now we have the newest version, some important bug fixes. Maybe not for that game because we did not encounter those bugs, but maybe if you improve on that game or make your own stuff, then those fixes will help you for sure. Then there was a bug that, not really a bug, but a problem that some people faced with the tiled map editor. And I actually was not aware of that, but when I started one of my new side projects, I encountered actually the same problem than the users in the comments area. And the reason is that with tiled 1.9, I think, yeah, so with one of the latest versions in the tiled editor, there they changed something. So you might remember from our map, there was a so-called type before here, where we specified if something was if an entity was or an object was a player or a slime, or I think here it was a chest exactly. But they changed that now, this unified custom types. Don't ask me why they did that. I don't follow that a lot. I normally just, whenever I need the editor, I download the latest version and use it. And there, for whatever reason, they removed now this type property and replaced it with a so-called class property. Also, when we save now our map file, then the TMX file that is created stores or removes actually this type property now and replaces it with a class property. I asked in the libGDX GitHub already, so I raised there an issue that this class property is not read by libGDX, so we cannot access it. And they just mentioned it's not so easy to fix because of the backwards compatibility, and they suggest that we should simply use for now this compatibility object that is available in tiled, but I don't know how to activate that. So I see that it's a project property, I guess, a project-wide compatibility option. So I guess you would need to create a project. So there from file, new, you cannot create only a map, you can also create a project. But since I never created a project and I don't even know when I have a map like here, I don't know how to convert it to a project, how that is working. I did not even try that out. If someone of you knows that, then great. But for me, the easy option was to simply don't use this class property here anymore because as mentioned, libGDX does not read that, so we don't have access to that. One solution would be we create a custom property for every object, so which is of course possible. Here we could simply still add our type property from before and use it, but what I prefer and what I think is even has some benefit, so we can simply remove it from the class or from the type and put it inside the name. That also has the benefit that the object itself in tiled has this little name at the top of the graphic, so we can simply move that from the class to the name, and we need to do a small code adjustment, which I show you in a moment. But yeah, this is the bug fix the change to support tiled 1.9. So I think that's everything, the player, the two slimes, and the chest. So now we save that, and now we would have a problem. So when we load now the map, then we get this problem here that blah 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 tiled map object does not have a type. And the problem is in our code where we are actually getting the type, and there we need to simply change one small thing. So we don't read the type anymore from the map object. Now we read the name, and we can also change here the error message that it mentions that the map object does not have a name instead of a type. And then it should work again. Okay, so that was the only single change. Yeah, as mentioned, for whatever reason with tiled 1.9, the type property got removed. They introduced this class, does not work yet with libGDX. No idea when that will be supported. So that's why I would suggest to simply use the name for now, change that little code piece here. And that has at least one benefit that I would see, that your objects already in the tiled editor have here a little text on their head, so that you can already see what kind of entity that is, which is maybe a benefit over the other approach. Then a small bug that I noticed, or I mentioned also in one of the videos, is that actually slimes damage themselves. So if we would, I don't try to reproduce it now, but if they are close to each other and they would attack the player, both of them, then slimes would damage each other. And also in theory, if the player would attack another player, then he would also damage himself. And there we can simply apply a small fix to that, so that that is not happening anymore. And for that we go to our attack system and down to our query function, where we check what kind of entities are within the attack range, and then we applied the damage here, and there we apply now a small fix down there. So first of all, we need a little property. So we check, is the player or is the attacker entity a player? And that is simply that the entity which is currently processed is in our player components. So this is actually the condition that we have here below, to check that the entity is a player. It's not is, this is in player components. So that one we can replace. So now we know if the attacking entity is a player or not. And now we simply want to check, is the attacker a player, and the entity that gets attacked, which is this fixture entity, is also a player. then we don't apply the damage. And also if the entity that is attacking is not a player and the fixture entity is not a player, then we also don't apply the damage. So that allied entities are not dealing damage to each other. So we simply turn off, let's write it down here, turn off friendly fire. Okay, and that's it. So once again, so we want to know, is the attacking entity a player? If it is, and the entity that gets attacked is also a player, then we don't apply any damage. So we return simply the query and continue with the next entity that is found. And the same, so if it is not a player and the attacked entity is also not a player, then we also return here true. So this is actually, that line here fixes the problem that the slimes would deal damage to each other. I also applied those changes, everything that I talk about in this part, I also applied that to the GitHub repository so that you can look it up there. So that was a small fix with the attack system here, or with the damage system actually. Okay, and then one of the last things that we want to improve in this part is the collision spawning and despawning. So let me quickly turn on the debug system. And what I noticed there and what I mentioned, I think maybe in the comments or at the end of the part, I cannot remember that anymore. There I mentioned that actually, so the spawning of collision objects, like here for the tree or for the stone here or that stone here, is actually happening in a rectangular way because we go through the tiled map from, I don't know, from here to around that area, for example, around the player, and we spawn the collision objects. But the despawning of the collision objects is actually happening via a circle shape. So that one here, which I think one of the users in the comments areas faced as well. It is a little bit tricky when you don't use the correct values for the spawning area and despawning area. So for example, if you come diagonally, I pronounce that very weirdly, but you know what I mean, diagonally, well, complicated word for me, then it could be that you are at the edge of the spawning area, but also at the edge of the despawning area, and that could have some strange side effects. So there, we need to be a little bit careful. And I mentioned that it makes more sense, in my opinion, if we use the same shapes. So for example, spawning is happening in a small rectangular around that, for example, here of the player entity, and the despawning also simply in a rectangular around the player, which is a little bit bigger. That makes it then easier, then you cannot have those edge cases with the circle and a rect, so with the two different shapes. And you might think, hey, that's fairly simple. So for example, some smart people out there of you might think, okay, let's simply go to our physics components where we create those collision shapes, and they have this circle sensor here for the despawning. And as we are now experts already of box2D, we simply replace that with a box call, and we simply use the same property here, so the spawn area for the width and height, and also we make that a sensor. And that should be already it, right? So now it's no longer a circle, now it's a box. And let's start our game. Let's make it a little bit bigger. So you see, yeah, so we have now boxes instead of circles, and yeah, something despawned there. There's also a spawning. And what is that? Something is not getting despawned. So it looks like some of the collision objects are spawning, but never despawning. Why is that? Pause the video and try to think about it. I will explain the solution in a moment. Okay, let me quickly restart it so that we can start from scratch. It's a little bit annoying that the slimes are so fast, but I think they hopefully never reach the tree here at the top. And now, first of all, do you notice something here with this box? Because that is part of the problem. The problem is here, as you already see, the box is not correctly centered. So it's actually a little bit to the left and a little bit to the bottom of this body here. So this is our collision object here, the stone. And the area of detection for the despawning here is actually not correctly centered. And that leads to a problem where we have the problem with that the despawning is not working properly. Because for our system to properly work, we assume that the spawning is only happening when an entity is already part of that area. But with that problem here, that it's actually spawning, but without an entity inside, we are then facing an issue that it's not correctly despawning. So here for the tree, let me get a little bit close to it. So you see, so those collision objects are now spawned, and our player should be inside of that area. but he isn't. So he's actually outside here, and that is a problem because, as you might remember, there is this nearby entities list of the collision object, and we already add the player to that. So those collision objects here think that the player is nearby, but in fact he is not. He's outside of that area, and that's why, for example, those objects here will never despawn. So for those it will work, but for those two, for example, it will never work. So they will never despawn anymore, and that is a bug. But it's actually quite easy to solve. We simply need to adjust the spawning of the collision or of the sensor here, that it correctly centered around the body. So that would be the solution to that. And let's fix that now. So we need a certain offset in here, so which is the third parameter of this box, which is this position here, which actually offsets the box a little bit. And the offset is actually simply the half of the body width and the body height. Then it's already centered. And what we don't want, or what we can improve here a little bit, we maybe don't want to create a new vector here all the time. Maybe because it's a simple offset that we need for all of those. So what I did on a GitHub project, at least, I simply created here a temporary vector that we can use. Which is only used in that area here, in that piece of code here. And there we simply set it now to the, as mentioned, so the body width, half of it, and the height, half of it. And then we pass it in here as the third argument. Like that. And now those boxes are correctly centered. And in addition, we can also improve something what I thought of, because in the spawn system where we define actually the spawn area size, it doesn't really need to be the size of 3. We can simply reduce that to 1, so that we really only spawn the tiles which are directly next to or adjacent to our entity, which also improves it a little bit, because then we reduce the amount of objects which are created and removed. So now, for example, I think this tree, okay, it does not have a collision object, but this tree here, so this is now next to our player. Okay, now the slime is also next to it. Let's go to our test tree at the top here, where before we had some issues. Now those issues should be solved. So now when we are directly next to the tree, we are spawning those objects, and as you see, they are now also correctly removed again. So with the adjustment, so it's actually not 100% perfect. Maybe we should increase the area to +3, because what I notice here, when I go diagonally, I can see that they still don't despawn correctly. At some point they will. Let me try to change that, but I think doesn't matter. You get the idea. So this would be how to change or improve our logic here a little bit to use then the box, and that is correctly centered around it. So maybe that one should be a little bit bigger with the way we spawn. Let's try a +3. Let me quickly try that out. Maybe that is the perfect solution. Okay, so I changed it to a value of 4. That seems to be now perfect. What I can imagine, because the way we use the position, I cannot remember anymore. Do we use the center to spawn our collision objects, or do we use the bottom left? So it's still not 100% accurate, but now we are always, when something is spawning, we are completely inside the rectangular shape there. And now even if I move diagonally, it seems to work properly. So that looks good to me. So that was the change. So I changed it now to 4, +4 here instead of +2. And yeah, that looks now fine. So that was the improvement to the collision spawning and despawning. And the last thing for this part, which is a little bit of a preparation for the next part with the user interface, is that we need to reduce the size of our user interface stage. So when we go to our game screen, there you see that we used quite a big resolution for our user interface, which would be totally fine if our graphics also for the user interface are big enough. But I used some pixel arts again, which are usually normally small graphics with, I don't know, at most 300 pixels width, for example, wide, or 150 pixels high, something like that. So having a user interface stage with that size or that resolution makes then our graphics very small. We would then always need to scale it to look good enough. And I did not want to do that, so I simply reduced here the size of our user interface stage from 1280 by 720 down to 320 by 180. that alone has, of course, some side effect. Maybe some of you know which side effect it has. So everything looks good, no problems. We can turn off the debug system again, by the way. But now when we damage a slime, what the hell? Those are some big numbers, right? They are super huge. And of course, because the font that we created for the damage part is based or was working with the resolution that we had before, we could now in theory open up Hero again, make the font a little bit smaller. But in my opinion, what is good enough for us, and which is an easy fix, that's also just that you have seen it. So let's go to our, I think it was the live system. There we have this damage font exactly, and there we simply scale down now our font. So here we do not only create the bitmap font, we also access the data of that font, and there is a set scale function, and we scale it down, for example, by 1/3, something like that. So that one here should now scale down the numbers once more. Let's check. So let's make it big once more, and now let's damage that little slime. Okay, yeah, now the numbers look good again. So they are now small. And also that we don't forget about it, let's turn off our debug system here. Okay, and that's actually it. So that was everything that I wanted to cover. So we improved the Fleks version. We supported now the newest tiled version by using the name instead of the type, or nowadays called this class. If someone knows how to convert a map to a project, then please let me know or send me a link to the tutorial or to the documentation where that is mentioned, because then we could also turn on this compatibility mode that is mentioned. We improved the collision handling with the spawning and despawning, that both are working with a rectangular shape. We fixed our damage system, that allied entities do not damage themselves anymore, so they really only damage now enemy entities, which is also great. And we reduced the size of our user interface stage, which is necessary for the upcoming part when we are now creating a user interface for our game. Okay, thanks for watching, guys. Have a good day and bye-bye.